think we can start this panel punctually. It's 3 o'clock. First of all, I'm very, very happy that we are able to have this discussion here. My name is Małgorzata Bonikowska. I'm the president of the Center for International Relations, but also of the think tank, which basically deals with business issues. So that's exactly what we are trying to discuss in the panel. What is the perspective? What are prospects for business in the era, in the time when we are facing major disruptions and a huge competition, we can put it this way, or even, hostile behavior between two big powers, the United States and China, and what this conflict, this tension will bring to us. That's the topic, and let me introduce our guests today. Let me start with our guests, our panelists online. We have Katarzyna Kacperczyk. Dzień dobry, Kasiu.
Dzień dobry.
Katarzyna was our deputy foreign minister for many, many years. The whole career actually in the foreign ministry, foreign office. She was working also in our embassy to the UN, and now she works in the Warsaw School of Economics. So thank you for being with us today. And we have also Professor Yu Bin from Russian Studies Center of the East China Normal University in Shanghai. Good morning, good afternoon, Professor.
Morning.
Thanks for being with us as well. And here in Krynica, physically, we have two gentlemen, both very, very experienced in the topic, especially as far as China is concerned. Professor Bogdan Góralczyk. Dzień dobry, panie profesorze.
Bonjour.
Professor Góralczyk just had a panel here, so everybody knows him. He is a sinologist, actually, but he's professor of international studies and also our former diplomat. He was our ambassador to Thailand. And Krzysztof Domarecki. Good afternoon.
To po takim wstępie profesora mi wypada powiedzieć ni hao.
Ni hao. Pan prezes Domarecki, Krzysztof Domarecki is a president. He was a president for many, many years of one of our most successful companies, Selena. Now he's in the president of the supervisory board of this company, and also an investor and creator of his own investment fund called Fidias, as this Greek famous person. So very experienced in creating businesses and scaling up businesses. And his company, Selena, has factory in China and also in many other places on Earth. It's a global business today. So the first question I would like to put to Katarzyna, just using your experience in foreign affairs and in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, if you can just explain to us, how did it happen? What are really the factors of this rivalry that now we are facing? Because just 5 years ago even, or 10 years ago, China and the United States were really cooperating rather. Many American businesses were moving to China. And of course, China became a factory of the world. Even in Poland, we had a very huge hopes for investment from China. We signed a strategic partnership with China in 2011. So can you just tell us what happened?
That's an interesting question, so thank you very much for that. You provided some input on the cooperation both United States, but also the countries of the European Union had with China. But we have to remember that actually, despite this cooperation, both China and United States were always very protective markets. There were, and probably from the business perspective, President Domarecki can tell more. But there, from my experience, also from the ministry, there were always a lot of restrictions, barriers, subsidies, hidden non-tariff barriers in China, but surprisingly also in the United States. So we always have to, despite the cooperation, despite the agreement, and also despite joining admitting China to WTO. We have to keep in
2001.
mind that both countries have a long history of restrictions in trade and investment. One new element of what we are seeing today is that we are facing the changing nature of the international situation, in which actually economics does not matter that much as before. What I would like to say by saying this is that when we were talking before about restrictions, trade agreements, we were mostly concentrating on purely trade aspects, barriers, subsidies. This was also the issue of diplomats, politicians. Now we are facing like a new phenomena where there is more. Two major elements which are actually influencing the policies and also debate on the three. I can hear something wrong with the connection.
We hear you, but what you want to say, basically, what I got is just politics, just a step down.
Yes, but also, internal factors like a populist pressure, right? When you look at how it started, actually, this escalation with Trump policies. So it was not like expert debate. It was like a populist, nationalist debate on how we target now the China. So the similar way it works also in China, but also in other countries in the way. So meaning trade policy is no more only limited to trade and economics, but also has to look on public debate, on populist. Almost every issue is debated in the public, right?
Your point.
Starting from solar panels and etc.
Kasiu, 1 second. I got your point that you are saying that, 10 years ago, let's say, or 15 years ago, business was just interested in business, trade was trade, and these two spheres were separated. When politics stepped down, it created a lot of issues. Maybe we have now politicians, we have ambitions of individuals, of the countries, and also maybe we have this questioning of the world order we are living in, or we have been living in. I want to ask Professor Bin, what is your perspective, looking at the same, the same phenomenon from the Chinese perspective? How could you describe it? Because China was very much fitting into this international system, was very much for globalization, was being kind of a beneficiary of this global economic development. What happened?
Thank you very much for inviting me to this distinguished Krynica forum. I'll make a few quick points to respond to your question. Let me say that I agree completely with you and others that until a few years ago, this was a non-issue. US-China had worked okay, and so why suddenly a trade war? The first point I want to make is the trade war has no winners, as Chinese repeatedly claim. This is also the title of a recent foreign policy article, foreign policy journal in America, just published last month by Michael Hirsch. The title, I quote, "Who is winning the US-China trade war? No one," unquote. And in this biggest trade war, both sides suffered, though to different degrees. And for better or worse, others, including Europe, have been deeply affected by particularly the US overreach, particularly the recent US decision to de-link and to punish anyone who do business with China on semiconductors, including many European firms. So the second point I want to make is that this trade war is by no means an isolated issue, but an extension of a broader contestation between the two largest powers across the political, strategic, and the military spheres. In fact, America launched the trade war with China 4 years before Russia's war with Ukraine, and 2 years before COVID started to devastate the world. So the question is, what is the outcome? So let me take up the US side. I mean, America, even before COVID, this trade war had caused visible harm to the US economy, and the US companies, consumers borne the brunt of the cost, ranging from 300,000 job loss and estimated 0.3% of the real GDP, according to a Moody assessment, or Bloomberg estimate of $316 billion loss on the US side, or $1.7 trillion, according to a more recent research by the Columbia University. A trade war may not have absolute winners, but the US-China story clearly shows the minimum effect of the US trade deficit, which remains almost unchanged from the pre-trade war years. Can I have the slides of the trade deficit slides? For better or worse, the Biden team continues Trump's trade war with China, even if it contributes significantly to the current US stagflation, which is very high, the highest ever since the early 1980s, as far as my memory goes. Between its economic imperative and the political correctness, meaning anti-China, Biden apparently chose his political career over the welfare of the American people. And nobody talk about it, even if it continued to harm the US economy. The
Professor,
third point I want to make is, I'm
I
sorry.
would like just to ask, if I may, at that moment, because you are saying that no one really profits out of this situation, however, we are having it. I want to just confront it with the businessman opinion. Krzysztof, I would like you to comment on that. I mean, what is really business expecting, and what is also business facing? Because you have a factory in China, operating all over the world, in other continents as well, not only in Europe. How do you see from the practical point of view, this situation?
Okay. First of all, from business perspective, what we see that in the last 50 years, global business community was engaged heavily to install production in Asia, particularly in China. And tens of thousands of companies across the Pacific Ocean, but also in Europe, were engaged to create the biggest in mankind history trade and production cooperation. For the moment, when we look at numbers, because as a practitioner, let's look for the numbers, 2021 was the year of record trade between China and US. $150 billion export from US to China, and over 500 billions export from China to US, means 350 billion deficit. What does it mean? That real cooperation between these two countries is so high and so tight, it is so multidimensional connection, so multi-layer connection, that any trade war would be a total disaster for both of these countries, and the same is with Europe. Let's take a look that in Europe, we have a slightly higher export to China, which is over $200 billion, but still we have a deficit of more than $260 billion as a Europe whole, not one country.
But do you see a difference since 2001 and today, 20 years? There is a difference in operating in China for the Western businesses. And
there is a big difference in operating in China, but at the same time, the global cooperation between Europe and China is much tighter than it was in 2001. Between US and China is much tighter, and between US and Europe is also much tighter. So all of three these economical giants are so deeply connected that I cannot imagine any, we call it trade war. In my opinion, trade war is a the way to describe the problem very in 19th century mentality.
But in a way, the businesses in America especially, but also in Europe, think, especially after pandemic, how to shorten the distribution chains, the production chains, and there are some businesses who already decided to withdraw from China. They moved, not necessarily back to Europe or to the US, but to other Asian countries. Are you facing also, I mean, do you agree that this will be the trend?
Not easy. First, let's take a look what kind of production we have moved to China, to Asia, particularly to China within last 50 years. Steel, chemical production, drug components, assembly, which means cheap labor, cotton and textile, shoes, means cheap labor or the production which is harmful to environment. Today, especially in Europe, I cannot imagine that any community, any green party or green organization would accept to taking back to Europe steel production or chemical production or drug components production. All of those are not in line with European environment rules. So first, we are blocked by environmental rules. Second, in Europe, also in US, we don't have any free labor space, any free labor to take the job. In Europe, thousands of companies, especially West Europe now, they are working for less than one shift because they don't have labor. In US, labor market is also quite tight. The labor, since last 15, 20 years, unemployment is really low. So I don't see on the real background any fundaments to take over this job back to US or to Europe.
Well, so if we look at the situation from a pragmatic point of view, it seems like there is no other solution. The best choice would be just to continue to cooperate. But now let me ask Professor Góralczyk, who is an analyst,
Not
professor,
so easy to cooperate.
and yes, and diplomat. If this is the solution, why we are going into the opposite direction, at least it seems?
You know, as a sinologist, it is not surprising answer. We have 20 Congress in Beijing of Chinese Communist Party, and they are talking about the new era in China. But to my mind, we have a new era in global affairs. And I will give you some examples answering your initial question for this debate. First, we have a name, Clyde Prestowitz, like you dealing with Asia for some 50 plus years, mainly with Japan, but also China. And 2 years ago, as an 81-year-old, he wrote a book, The World Upside Down, that everything is different than it was a decade or two ago. And subtitle was, How We Americans Produce a China Power. So this is another story. Secondly, you do remember, all of us elder, the main slogan of Bill Clinton, economy, stupid. Not anymore. We have a new slogan, security, stupid. And not only Ukraine in our minds, also our personal security, energy security. We are talking daily about the energy suppliers.
So you want to say that this dominates our thinking, and
No, what I want to say is still in front of us. This is just appetizers. The point number one is rising China. In actually 30 years after 1992, when China joined the global markets. And it was speeded up by the joining by China of the WTO in December 2001. And when China, or personally, Mr. Xi Jinping pronounced and announced his Belt and Road Initiative 2013, finally, too late to my mind, Americans woke up. First think tanks, later academic circles, finally politicians. They are always sleeping, and politicians were the last ones. Trump administration completely changed the approach. My predecessor just mentioned, everyone was competing to go to China. 1 billion customers was the slogan. Since Trump, we have completely different story.
But
Instead of engagement, we have strategic competition.
But the business wants still to do business with China.
Wait a moment. It is, I'm already starting to deliver the main dish. And now, what has happened thereafter? When Trump announced in March 2018 trade war, customs war, surprisingly, 2020, we have global pandemic. And what is going on? We have another front, not only trade and customs, we have media war, we have ideological war, we have axiological war constantly growing in every particular country of the world, visible in Poland, visible in the European Union, and dominated by US. And last but not least, during the pandemic, another front line was open, cyberspace, because no one recognized in the world what China done in last 5 or 7 years in space. This is a tremendous jump, and Americans awaken that this is a toughest competitor ever met by United States of America, and what we are observing now is something beyond economy. Instead of globalization, we are starting to talk about deglobalization or decoupling, because we have constantly growing competition, and this is a final nail to this coffin, and we have an open war in Ukraine, which is also dividing us tremendously.
So immediately I have to have a reaction of Christopher, because you say that decoupling is not possible. That's what I understood, that it will be almost impossible from the business perspective. So who will prevail? Politicians thinking about security, or the business?
Visionaries.
First, like Professor said, we have multidimensional conflict in many domains, including space, including science, including ideological and so on, also axiological, I fully agree. The problem is that on practical economy, decoupling will be not easy because of last 50 years of making goods and things together. So, on one hand, politicians and strategists thinking with old country versus country way are trying to start to compete, and we didn't discover that they did it too late, probably 20 years too late. But on the other hand, in the meantime, all of global, not businesses, but nations, people, also countries, engaged so deeply together that they are like brothers, and brothers
Cain
that are,
and Abel.
No.
They were brothers
No,
too.
like Siam brothers, rather like a Siam brothers, and to fight and at the same time to cooperate with such a tight cooperation is not easy. And I would like to say, because going the way the professor proposed, in my opinion, decoupling, real decoupling, if will take place, will be more tough for humankind than atomic bombs.
Oh.
Because it will destroy social contract in West first. It will destroy pension funds in US immediately. First victims of decoupling will be stocks in US. Stocks in US means pension funds and the level of pension of US pensioners. So the results will be really disaster for all.
Professor Yubin, I want to ask you about what you think China wants. Does China want decoupling? Because, well, could be a beneficiary if this is the effect in the United States. Maybe that's the way to hit badly. Or does China want a globalization? Or China wants to be isolated right now? Because that's what we are seeing after pandemic. Still, China didn't reopen. So what does China want?
Thank you for the question. Let me quickly echo some of the points of the two previous, all the rest of the panel. I agree with many of their observations and remarks. And here is the biggest question: that China suddenly become an 800-pound gorilla. And to some, if not all, in America and perhaps in the West, the collective West, the rise of China economically, which is largely economic phenomenon, is simply unacceptable. Some years ago, President Obama actually said it's when China would have the same per capita GDP of the United States, the world will dead because China simply have too many, damn Chinese, and that's the mentality of some who have been behind this trade war and the all-round competition with China. So the rise of non-West, non-white, perhaps Asian, China is simply unacceptable. I don't want to get too much of that. But what China really wants, I think you have to read to a certain extent, look at China as it is rather than what you think to become. The Chinese simply want a good life, a stable life, as much as Westerners want, for better or worse. But that's, plus, in the past 40, 50 years, China has not done something stupid, which means the long-term strategic mistakes as some America or other Western countries have done. Let me give you one episode. In March 2019, I went to the Carter Center in Atlanta, Georgia, in America. The former President Jimmy Carter actually was there, and he was talking for hours. And he mentioned one episode in a telephone conversation with the then President Donald Trump. Trump actually asked Jimmy Carter, "How come China builds so many high-speed rail, and we don't have any? What's going on? China's airport infrastructure is so good, and we have like a third world level." Jimmy Carter's response was very interesting. He said, "Look, what has China done in the past 40 years? Does China fight any wars? Zero. And we have non-stop wars. Only 16 years of U.S. history, we did not fight wars. So that's the two biggest contrasts of the foreign policy, economic policy, or in general. That America is a force of destroying other countries and spending those dollars overseas, burning them in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria. Look at that. None of them has turned out to be what some people wish to become stable democracies. And China is not to fight, drop a single bomb. That's the huge difference. It's a choice that the political elite made in West, in America particular, and the political choice of China. By the way, the rise of China is essentially an economic rise. The Chinese learned hard lessons. Before the economic reform, China suffered from extreme ideologicalization of the country, pretty much like America today, or in Europe too, politicize almost everything. The Chinese learn the lessons. The Chinese are not saints, but they learn from the lessons and to avoid as much as possible those huge long-term strategic mistakes. China made lots of smaller mistakes. China is not perfect, but basically the Chinese want pretty much the Westerns want. Let me give you a final example. During the COVID years, 2020, China finally eliminated absolute poverty of almost 100 million people, period. Accomplishments that have been the effort for decades, if not the years, of the Chinese government and Chinese people. Working in China is very hard, and you have to work very hard in China. I work and live in the States. I see that people just gave up in the woke culture, and I guess many in Europe, people simply stop working. And some panelists mentioned the trade unions. Trade unions essentially wanting less work and more pay, right? But the mentality, the work ethic in China has been very hard. Competition is very severe, and I mean serious, and people really want to elevate themselves. And the Chinese really has lots of competition. The Chinese companies actually compete at home first before they acknowledge themselves to the world. And it happened to be China has a huge market. And that market really facilitates the growth of Chinese company through competition, not government necessarily. Even the government, enterprise have to compete in the market as much as the private enterprises. So that's, I think, what happened in China, and economics in charge, and pragmatism in charge. China made lots of mistakes, but has been able to avoid Mao's era of huge political sway, and which has devastated many parts of Chinese political and economic life. So Chinese learn, and I hope that this is, China's kind of like approach, maybe unique, but the pragmatism, not ideology, has governed the Chinese political elite till today. The Cultural Revolution generation, including myself, learned the hard lesson from the hard life. And we are pragmatic. We question everything, but we also borrow things from other countries, including Europe, including America, including even Russia, Japan, Taiwan. This is the approach. Be pragmatic and to avoid extremism, avoid ideologicalization.
So when
So this is what's going on in the West now.
Professor, let me stop here, and to summarize, if I understood correctly, you are convincing us a little bit, like saying that China is like the United States used to be, as far as being pragmatic, competitive, being so much hardworking. So all this leads China to just, want to be as wealthy as the West, and that's the pragmatism of Chinese, while the West is reacting on this newcomer, being afraid of losing what we are having. Katarzyna, I want you to describe, taking into consideration that A, you are economist, B, you know very well, the EU, and especially from the foreign policy view, the mechanism of coordination and taking decisions in foreign policy. And C, you know also quite well United States. How would you describe the dynamic between the two? The US, while looking today at China as a rival, total rival, we can say, and EU, which is not as radical in this view, but it's also, especially vis-a-vis war in Ukraine, having this approach that we have to stick to the US. We are one world, so we should maybe have a similar approach towards China.
That's also actually very interesting question. So thank you very much for that. So I spent many years at the United States, but I also spent many years at the UN, and I remember time when there was like a joint framework of cooperation called multilateralism, effective multilateralism. during the Trump, as you remember, the relationship between US and then the European Union was probably the worst in the history of both EU and then the United States. The trade and investment agreement, the famous TTIP, was put aside, and as we can see, never brought to the table again. But also now, because of the war in Ukraine and this geopolitical context, we can observe that both US and then EU are coming together in united not only by the security issues, but also by common agenda and also by this rivalry with China. If you look, I mean, we have discussed many times about the uselessness or the crisis of WTO. But recently, when you look at what's going on in the trade discussions in Brussels or in the United States, so we can see more meetings and more discussion about how to revive WTO and how to revive the appellate panel. And actually, both the European Union and also United States, they use still WTO, this multilateral framework to address this, to respond to China policies and restrictions and etc. So I see here a lot of commonalities, and of course, United States now has another concept of multilateralism. You know, this concept of reinvigorated multilateralism, where workers now are at the center, and then the free market has been completely moved from the public debate. But still, I think it's because EU and US has been brought together. So I see a lot of potential to actually to have like a new framework of cooperation, and also on dealing with China rivalries. One other point is, which is probably very much which is important. You can see when the trade war between US and China started in 2018 with Trump imposing tariffs on Chinese goods, and then other measures from the Chinese part. There were a lot of EU countries who were thinking, okay, we will now benefit from the trade war. And in fact, there was some benefits to some countries, both as far as replacing Chinese export to US and also replacing part of the US export to China. But when you look at the data after 2 years or 3 years, actually it didn't help. It didn't apply, this philosophy didn't apply in the medium and longer run. Also, the other aspect is that we don't say anymore about the trade war because between US and China. What we can see recently, what happened with semiconductors and chips and etc. So we move to the technology war, and actually soon to the total economic war. So this will bring, in my opinion, also EU and US together.
So this is a new dimension also about this tension between the US and generally the West and China. Before I put my final question, I would like to see if there is anyone who wants to contribute to our discussion, any comment or question. Yes, please. Do we have a microphone to give? Just please introduce yourself.
Piotr Parzucha, I'm a finance director here in Poland. So a question of my field of expertise. The Chinese currency, the renminbi, do you think it has potential to become maybe not the dominant, but a significant currency of the international trade, first in the Southeast Asia region, secondly, perhaps worldwide? If no, why not? If yes, why yes? And what conditions would there need to be fulfilled for that to happen?
Thank you for the question. I hope Katarzyna and Professor Yubin heard the question. It's about currency, Chinese currency. How strong can it be? So I don't know who wants to take it. Who wants to take? Professor Yubin, you would like to comment on
Yeah,
that?
yeah. Let me try it. I'm not economist, but I would say that there are two things going on. The strength and the scope of a country's currency really closely related to the economic potential and power of the country. So with the continued steady increase of Chinese economic power, the Chinese currency will gain some ground on the international currency market, and but the U.S. dollar remains the dominant instrument and for exchange, and also those U.S. and Western-controlled financial system will be continuing to dominate the scene. Having said that, there has been a trend of engaging, dealing with Chinese currency, including the recent EU-China currency exchange. I believe it's about 600 billion euros that the European purchased, and basically as an element of stability in the volatile, market of today. And also China and many other countries, including Russia, including many Asian countries, start to use renminbi and the local currencies for transactions, bypassing the US dollars, largely because of what is seen by others, that the overuse of dollar as a financial weapon to punish Russia, for example. This is really a case that the United States and the West collectively use, punish Russia and de-link and cut off Russia from international financial market. So the lesson of the Russian war and U.S. sanctions and Western sanctions is also played here. So the use of renminbi and others is a natural reaction to that for security, basically. Okay, but U.S. dollar remains a predominant agent
And
for
US
transactions.
dollar
Thank you.
is being stronger and stronger because euro is now, unfortunately for us, weaker. I don't know, Chris or Katarzyna, do you want to
I
add
can
something? Yes,
maybe,
please.
because I think Professor outlined it perfectly. I would maybe only add one dimension. If you look what's going on in the world recently, but also especially in China, I think that in terms of this currency issues, also the move to digital currency and all the innovations which are connected to the questions of currency, and also engagement of central banks and also China Central Bank in working on digital currency, will be probably a factor which could diminish dependence of the China on US dollars. And you could observe that for a long time China looked from the side, right, on what's going on in this digital currency world. So the Chinese Central Bank didn't engage really in this issue. But over the last few months, or then there was really, speed up of introducing new technologies and examining how we can control actually the official accounts of the bank, and then introduce the digital currency into the bank policies. So I would recommend this will be a very interesting factor in judging and in trying attempts of China to reduce the dependence on US dollars.
Thank you for this comment. Our time is almost over, but I want to conclude with two gentlemen here to ask you both the same question, actually from your perspective. One analytical, academic more, another one very practical and also business-oriented. how the situation can really evolve in the nearest future, and what would you expect, knowing both of you, knowing the situation here and there, understanding all these processes we are discussing, that politics is back, that business has to sometimes follow, you know, even if they don't want to, follow the political decisions, taking into consideration that security is number one. What can happen? And now we are having the meeting of the Communist Party in China. Professor.
Fortunately, we are out of record.
But we are allowed to have
honestly.
2-3 minutes more.
Secondly, I'm very fortunate not to answer about the currency, because if I would be an expert, I would send you best regards from Seychelles or Maldives instead of sitting here. To put it strongly, in a nutshell, you previously asked, what does China want? I do not know what does China want, but I seem to know what Xi Jinping wants, which, starting from next coming Monday, what does China want will be the same
Because
answer.
he will be the leader forever, right?
In this respect, we have a lady from China, so she can confirm that I'm not lying speaking Chinese. Even yesterday, I was watching perfectly the Congress, and there's only one slogan: 中华民族伟大复兴而奋斗.
Great.
Correct? Correct. Which means, what does Xi Jinping want? A great rejuvenation, great renaissance of Chinese nation, and we need to fight for it. The problem is that if you want Chinese rejuvenation and renaissance, you cannot escape one question. Then on both sides of Taiwan Straits, you have entities with Chinese name. So the story is not over. And this is a problem that China treated as a domestic issue, and US treated as its unsinkable ship, yes. And on the other hand, what does America want? We do remember, make America great again. Of course, Trump is not with us anymore, but America first is also the Biden slogan.
And Trump can be
And
back.
Trump is coming to town again already in midterm elections, which is next month. And to finalize it, I told you I will be brute, out of record. I will quote Chinese again. Confucius. 天不二日, 地不二王. Like you don't have two suns on the sky, you cannot have two emperors on the earth.
Oh God, that
And
sounds really bad.
And this is the story.
Wow, thank you. Christoph, just a little bit more optimistic, maybe?
It was not me, it was Confucius.
Okay, it is clear that we are moving from unipolar world to multipolar world, and all these things that we take a look and it engage a lot of our emotions and attention are only step-by-step next stages of this multipolar world. And Taiwan issue or Ukraine issue or global trade or decoupling issue or trade war are also last behavior of Saudi king to reduce output of oil, only part of the move from unipolar world to multipolar world, and the same is with currency. We are moving step by step, of course, quite slowly. It will take another 30 years from one dominant currency to more local currencies or to more local currency agreements. I mean agreements. So this new world is one thing which is clear about this new world. It will be less stable.
Thank you, and I just hope, you know, it will be multipolar, not bipolar, because if it's bipolar, it is really bad for Europe. Thank you very much, gentlemen and ladies. Katarzyna Kacperczyk, profesor
Thank you.
Lubin, Krzysztof Domarecki i profesor Bogdan Góralczyk byli z nami, Małgorzata Bonikowska, Centrum Stosunków Międzynarodowych. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Auf
Thank you very
Wiedersehen.
much.
You.